Well, while they're, listen to this, while they're receiving and giving this information back and forth to each other looking for a solution, President Kennedy receives news that 25 Soviet merchant ships are heading towards Cuba. Our Navy has spotted those ships heading towards Cuba. Now, what do you think is going to be on those ships? Either stuff to build those launching pads or what? More missiles. Okay? They're merchant ships. They're not supposed to be carrying any arms to Cuba. Russia knows the United States would not be in favor of that. But obviously, when the word comes to Kennedy that the United States Navy sighted 25 Soviet merchant ships heading toward Cuba, which is quite a few at one time, the belief of XCOM was that the merchant ships had a likelihood of carrying missiles to Cuba or equipment to get those launching pads constructed. So this thing's getting worse. And on top of that, President Kennedy was supposed to visit Connecticut on Wednesday, the next day, and he wanted to cancel because of the crisis. He wanted to cancel. But his schedule had him going to Connecticut the next day, on Wednesday. What do you think Bobby Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell advised the president on that situation? Why to go?
So no one
That's exact. Very good. Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell convinced him to go on as normal. They did not want news of this crisis getting to the press and cause worldwide panic. So both Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell convinced the president to go on as normal with his schedule. It was crucial that the news of the crisis did not get to the press. That ends Tuesday, October 16th. That's what happened on that day. So they still haven't made a decision, have they? So now we'll talk about Wednesday, October 17th. What happens on this day? Well, he does some things. Just so you know, before he departs for his Connecticut trip on Wednesday, he attended a breakfast service at St. Matthew's Cathedral, where you'll get a chance to see. So he attends a breakfast service at St. Matthew's Cathedral. He does some other government business after he goes to church that morning at St. Matthew's Cathedral. He has lunch with the Crown Prince of Libya. And after he does that, he boards Air Force One and flies to Connecticut. So he gets up in the morning, he goes to a breakfast service at St. Matthew's Cathedral. He then takes care of some other government business in the morning, has lunch with the Crown Prince of Libya, which was on his schedule, and then he boards Air Force One and heads for Connecticut. Now, this gives you an idea of how much Bobby had a role in this. During the president's absence, when he was gone to Connecticut, XCOM met to discuss other options rather than airstrikes and invasion. Okay? And Bobby Kennedy kind of led the XCOM discussion. He was the one that was kind of the man in charge. So during the time that President Kennedy was in Connecticut, XCOM met to discuss other possible options rather than the airstrikes followed by invasion. Now, Bobby Kennedy was very, very concerned about these airstrikes and invasion because he thought this would be seen as a sneak attack by the United States against a much smaller country. Okay? It would be very unpopular around the world. And he did not think that was the number one option. He thought that was going to get us in trouble. Well, what does the military want to do? They want to airstrike and invade from the start, flex our muscle. And Bobby's receiving tremendous pressure from the committee, especially the military, to go ahead and invade, or airstrike and invade. Well, finally, Bobby Kennedy, picture this in your mind, he turns to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and he says, quote, "Bob, if we go ahead with these airstrikes, you know what it'll come to in the end. There's got to be something else. Give it to me." Think about that quote. "Bob, if we go ahead with these airstrikes, you know what it will come to in the end. There's got to be something. Give it to me." In other words, what's Bobby saying? You know, if we do this, who's going to take action? Think about what we've talked about. If we airstrike Cuba, an ally of Russia, invade, where's Russia going to go? What's that? You might have said it. Where are they going to go that we will not give up? We will not give up freedom in this area. Berlin. They know that if we do this in Cuba, that Russia's going to retaliate in Berlin. And if they retaliate in Berlin, we will not let Berlin go without a fight. We're going to be involved in a war with Russia. So that's why Bobby is so concerned about these airstrikes and invasion, because he says to Bob McNamara, you know what it will come to in the end. Well, McNamara thinks a minute, and he responded to the committee with a scenario that called for a naval blockade of all ships into Cuba. If you have a naval blockade of all ships going into Cuba, those 25 merchant ships that are probably carrying missiles don't get to Cuba. Rather than airstrike and invade, let's get our point across by having a naval blockade to let the Russians know we are not going to allow missiles into Cuba. That was the other scenario. Well, Kennedy continues his Connecticut experience, so to speak, and he returns to Washington, D.C., and the next day they're going to meet again, ExComm, to discuss. So really what happened on that Wednesday is Kennedy got up, had a breakfast, Mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral. He did some government business. He had lunch with the Crown Prince of Libya, and he turned things over to Bobby to get discussion going with ExComm. And when the discussion came up to airstrikes and invasion, Bobby was nervous about it, and they briefly discussed the possibility of a blockade. Okay, that moves us into Thursday, October 18th. This is a pretty interesting day. A little bit longer. We won't get through it all today, but we'll get a good start. Like I mentioned, on Thursday, October 18th, the President was scheduled to meet with ExComm again to continue these discussions, but prior to the meeting, he was given new information from a more recent spy mission over Cuba. So we continued our reconnaissance over Cuba after Heiser made the initial flight because we wanted to keep on top of this. So Kennedy got additional photographs prior to the meeting the morning of Thursday, October 18th. Now these new photos showed three different things. These new photos showed the possibility of probably at least 40 missiles on the ground in Cuba. 40 on the ground. So the new photos showed that there was a possibility of as many as 40 Soviet missiles on the ground in Cuba. Now, the missiles, again, it was re-emphasized to the President that they had a range ability that would reach every city in the United States with the exception of Seattle. So we got a little bit of a concern here. Well, they get into the meeting, and Kennedy asked Air Force General Curtis LeMay to give his recommendation. He asked LeMay to stand up and give his recommendation. What do you think his recommendation was? His recommendation is we have to have an immediate airstrike, Mr. President. Why does he want to have an immediate airstrike? Because he wants to get those missiles out of there before they become operational. That's what LeMay says. He briefs the President. He says we have to have an immediate airstrike on Cuba, and LeMay strongly believed that the missile sites had to be destroyed before they had a chance to become operational. Now, I just want you to put your pencil down or pen and listen to this conversation. You can go back and figure out what you want to write down. So LeMay comments to President Kennedy, says, quote, "All you got to do is say go, and my boys will get those red bastards." When President Kennedy asked LeMay if he really thought this was the best course of action to take, LeMay responded by saying, "Mr. President, I think this is our only course of action. America is in danger. The big red dog is digging in our backyard, and we are justified in shooting him. And sir, given your own statement about Cuba, I think a blockade or a bunch of political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as a pretty weak response. I suspect many of our own citizens would feel the same way. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." That's the comment he made. So what's he saying to the President? hey, all you got to do is say go and we'll attack. It's our only course of action. America's in danger. The big red dog is digging in our backyard, red dog being communist, and we are justified in shooting him. And then he kind of scolds the president, saying that any other course of action would be kind of chicken. You kind of catch that? And he ends it by saying, you're in a pretty bad fix. The president was taken back by that, and he said to LeMay, he said, what did you say? And LeMay repeated himself, I said you're in a pretty bad fix. And President Kennedy entered the conversation with, well, maybe you haven't noticed, you're in it with me. So it was a not very positive conversation. Kennedy was very frustrated, and he asked General LeMay, what do you think Russia's response will be if we attack Cuba? He asked LeMay that. LeMay said, nothing. Kennedy says, what do you mean, nothing? And LeMay responded by saying, nothing. Because the only alternative open to them is one they can't choose. Think about that. He said nothing because the only alternative open to them is one they can't choose. What's LeMay banking on? That they won't attack Berlin because they don't want to do what? Go to war. Kennedy responds by saying, if we killed Soviet soldiers, they're going to respond. I mean, how would we respond? They're going to do something, General. I will promise you that. Well, obviously the president believed that the Soviet Union would respond in West Berlin in retaliation for these attacks in Cuba. And if the United States were forced to defend the people of West Berlin, what was the chance we were going to have? A war. And what type of war? Nuclear. Okay? So, Kennedy listens to the military's recommendations, and he thanks the committee and excuses himself into his office. Who go with him to evaluate the situation on the meeting? Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell. Now, the members of the military, General LeMay, General Taylor, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, all left the meeting bewildered and incredibly angry. Because what did they expect the president to do that morning? Give him permission for the airstrikes and invasion. Okay? Now, here's where we'll end the day today. They're pissed, to say the least, because they think the president's being weak. Okay? The president's thinking, I'm not putting myself in a position to have to defend West Berlin and get us in a war, maybe nuclear war. I'm going to think about this a little bit. Well, later that afternoon, President Kennedy had already scheduled an appointment with Soviet diplomat Andrei Gromyko. Now, we talked about him before, but I'm going to write his name down for you so you can write it down. Now, Kennedy had already scheduled a meeting with this guy. And he is the Soviet diplomat to the United States. When Kennedy wants to communicate with Russia, he brings in these Soviet diplomats. Well, before the crisis was ever discovered, Kennedy had a meeting with this Soviet diplomat. It was on the books. And it's going to provide a key opportunity, because what do you think Kennedy's going to do? Because Russia does not know that the United States knows there's missiles in Cuba. Cuba doesn't know the United States knows there's missiles in Cuba. What do you think the focus of this conversation between Kennedy and Andrei Gromyko is going to be? Well, kind of. He's going to basically quiz him. Now, you would never put nuclear weapons in Cuba, would you? And he's going to want to see what his response is. He's going to want to see, A, if he knows anything about it, and if he does, if he's going to tell him the truth or lie. So this meeting was already scheduled, and they're going to meet in the Oval Office and discuss all kinds of items, but Kennedy is going to press him on the issue of he knows anything about missiles in Cuba, which you know he does, right? Well, we'll see what his response is tomorrow to Kennedy, okay? All right, so we'll continue this same day tomorrow with the conversation between President Kennedy and Andrei Gromyko. Okay, nice job, kiddos. Yeah.